Greetings from EnviCA. Thanks for joining today's wildlife webinar session. The webinar is moderated by Kiran Bbagade and myself.
I have done my graduation from Ruia College, which is the reason I'm into botany because of Dr. Bhavna Narula. She talks about plants even better than I do. I mean, I'm not saying good, but the way she speaks about plants got me interested. That's it. I mean, we had a boring curriculum, but to say the least, but the way she is passionate about plants, got many of us in love with botany. So I carried on with it in my master's from Pune University. Then fortunately I could work in forest of Karnataka to Karnataka Biodiversity Board. And that is when I got this big exposure to the world of plants and forests, and I could go into forest and see things for myself. And after that, I came back to Mumbai, and I've been working with Terracon Equative Private Limited since. We are a environmental consultancy. We work with biodiversity assessments and environmental impact assessments. So the love that we have for biodiversity, we try to get it in accordance with the corporates and the developmental projects that are happening around us, which is quite essential in today's world. So that is what we try to do, and I contribute through the knowledge and love for plants that I have to Terracon's work. So that's what I'm currently doing. And also, sidelines, I like to talk about plants. I want to do what my teacher did to me to a lot of people. I want them to at least respect plants, notice them whenever they take forest trails and they walk in even in the areas. So I also am a part of this Instagram group called Desi Tree Nursery, and we also we're taking tree walks live on Instagram occasionally. I also draw at Forest Shell, which is mostly doodles. Some of them are for awareness of regarding environmental issues and stuff like that. That's all about me. What I'm going to share with you today is something that you don't really hear a lot, or people don't talk about it a lot, but it's such an amazing thing about plants, about how they evolved from really primitive small beings, and now there's so much diversity everywhere. And in a world where plants are in general quite ignored because they just are there, what's there to know about them? I guess knowing where they come from and how they have developed themselves or how they've evolved into the amazing beings and amazingly diverse beings that they are today will help us take more note of them, maybe love them too, and not take them for granted that we usually tend to do. So today my topic is a glance at the plants. So it will be a very basic, very informal type of discussion about how plants came into being. I'll be talking about the entire plant kingdom. We'll start from the four type of plants, five of them basically, but the four are something that everyone has almost seen everywhere. I hope you all have recognized this or are familiar with the at least the type of plants that are on your screen right now. So the first one is a bryophyte, second one is a fern, a fancy photo of fern. Third one is a gymnosperm, and fourth one is of course a flowering plant. Kingdom planting is quite a fancy term for all the plants that exist, and initially in schools you might have learned that algae, fungi, flowering plants, non-flowering plants, everything comes under kingdom planting. But technically, after a lot of research and consideration and discussions and stuff, it was decided that fungi are not part of plants. They are quite different, very different, especially from their origin and in the terms of their evolution. So they have been removed from kingdom planting and they have their own world to rule now. So under kingdom planting, we have green algae, specifically green algae, mind you. We don't have red algae and brown algae that are considered as plant. Again, they are so different and they evolved from different origins. So they are not considered as under the umbrella of kingdom planting. So we will talk about green algae. We'll talk about liverworts, hornworts, mosses. Liverworts and hornworts might be a newish term for you, but mosses is quite common. Like we use moss, especially in gardens. The sphagnum moss is quite a famous medium for planting a lot of plants and quite famous. So then come the ferns, which are often planted in mosses. and it's a part of conversations in horticulturists and everyone. Conifers. Now, conifers are these cone-bearing plants, obviously from the name, and we know those who don't live in the Himalayan region know them from gardens, from courtesy of all the gardeners and horticulturists who have planted them everywhere for their beauty and their ease of maintenance, their beautiful form, their slow growth, and stuff like that. And flowering plants, of course, everything when we see plants, we think of nice leaves, branches, and nice flowers. So flowering plants is known to all of us. So scientifically, they're also called angiosperms. So we will be talking about these 5 types, how they are related to each other, how they give rise to another form from one. And I hope you enjoy this journey. So when we talk about these 5 kingdoms, I just want you to think of every single green form that you've ever seen in your life. Everything, every corner you've looked into, every nook you've peered into, and every single green thing that you've ever come across in your life. And I hope that you remember their forms. And today, they will make more sense to you, and their existence will be more precious to you in your minds. So we will be talking about, as I just a quick revision of what I said: the green algae, the mosses, the ferns, the conifers, and the flowering plants. Are we good to go? So I implore all of you to buckle up, because we are going to travel 3,500 500 million years ago to a world when algae were formed. So all these years ago, there was unicellular forms. There were very few forms which could photosynthesize. So there was practically very less oxygen in the atmosphere. And these unit cells, the single cells, they used to interact with each other. So one cell will feed on another, it will disintegrate, it will multiply, it will live its life in different ways than they do now. So what happened was, there was a cell which could not photosynthesize. They formed a cell which could photosynthesize. It had a protoplast. It had the chloroplast, the green pigment. And this cell which could not do photosynthesis once engulfed this another cell which could do photosynthesis. And then magic happened. So instead of being digested, this green cell, it just stayed inside its body as if it was its own organelle. Now this cell, which does not photosynthesize, has a cell inside it which can photosynthesize. So together this forms a unit which can photosynthesize. And that's how simply this evolution happened. And then came into being these slimy, moldy things that we see today. We still see them today, yes. So these are the blue-green algae, that BGA, which are so essential for oxygen production and the way they regulate the environment and way they spoil our walls in monsoons and stuff like that. So these gooey, slimy structures, they are the cyanobacteria. They're not plants precisely, they are cyanobacteria. They're closer to bacteria. And these plants, were the cells which engulfed the protoplast, which started then photosynthesizing. And eventually this form from a single cell which could now photosynthesize turned into, like a string of cells, a thallus of cells, like a sheet of cells which could photosynthesize. And that is how green algae came into being. So there was cells which could not photosynthesize. There was some tiny being which could photosynthesize. This cell which could not photosynthesize ate the one which could photosynthesize, then formed the cyanobacteria, and the cyanobacteria developed itself into green algae. Now, green algae are these full-on photosynthetic organisms which have chlorophyll A and B, which is quite similar to our land plants. One link that links the land plants to the most primitive organism ever, the green algae. So green algae, they exist today in aquatic environments, and they're strictly water loving. They need water for their survival and their reproduction and everything. So they cannot be without water. You must have seen a lot of algae that are around fresh water as well as marine. Marine algae are quite famous. Like the first slide about algae that we saw was a marine algae, a turf of algae, like a sheet of algae formed on rocks because it's so beneficial for them to just lay in sun and photosynthesize and chill. So these green algae are very essential in the ecosystems that they are in. Like in marine especially, they form the primary producers. Same in aquatic, I mean the freshwater ones also. They're the primary producers. They were the ultimate primary producers. Like before algae, the cyanobacteria and green algae came into existence. Imagine there was no oxygen, and just because this one cell decided to photosynthesize, like take sun's energy and take some carbon dioxide and take some water and make oxygen, and that's how oxygen came into being, and that's how all this existence, this life happened on earth. So green algae, coming back to present, is the primary producer. It produces oxygen. Entire world is obliged to them for the oxygen that we breathe every single minute. And it's also a food source. A lot of organisms depend on algae for their primary food source. So that is the basic importance, other than the medicinal and the nutraceutical uses of algae that humankind makes. And because green algae were the first plants that happened, they obviously are considered with proof that gave rise to rest of the plant diversity in this world. So they also can fondly be called mother of all plants. We're done with algae. Now we go to the second best thing that happened after formation of algae. Now algae were growing in water, right? And they saw that there's plenty of room on the land, and the water was receding, so there was more and more land coming out of water. So they thought, why not shift to land? Because opportunity, why not take it? So then the complexer green algae, which had a definite, robust, a strong thallus, a very flat body, it started living on land. And then it had to make some changes. Like if it's on land, it will need a system that will hold on to the land, that will hold it in one place. And then it also had to become more rigider. It could not rely on its mucilage, because mucilage will require water to maintain itself. So it had to get rid of that because it was on land now, where there was not a lot of water. And also, um, so green algae shifted on land. Okay, they started living on land now. And when they were green algae, they used to reproduce from this very simple, very almost negligent type of reproduction called production of spores, which is asexual. They also produce some gametes in some higher algae, which is sexual reproduction, which is very primitive type of sexual reproduction, where the male and female gamete are same in size. They can be different as well, but uniformly or quite commonly, they are same in size, and they just fuse and form a new cell, and it just forms a new thallus. That's it. There was nothing complicated about that. So there was just one type of body in algae which would do all this function. Okay. And when they started shifting on land, they formed these little more complexer creatures called bryophytes. Now, bryon in Greek is tree moss or moss, and phyton is plant tree. So that is why moss tree or moss plant is the bryophyte. Now, now look at the slide that you are seeing right now. There's some structure which is just large leaves, flat, very flat, with a nice purple border. And there are some interspersed in it which have leafy, kind of fluffy appearance. Both of them are bryophytes. And like I said before, the characteristic feature is that it migrated from water to land. So it is also called the amphibians of plant world. And they show this alternation of generation. Now that's the interesting part. Like I said, algae will have just one thallus producing spores as well as gametes. Okay, so when it came to land, it decided, I'm getting so much of upgrade, then why not upgrade the reproduction too? So it decided that it will form different structures for production of gametes and different structure for production of spores. Now, since it was just a beginner, it could not do both of it simultaneously. So what it decided was, one generation, I'll produce spores, and the next generation, you can produce the gametes. So that's how they decided that there'll be alternation of generation, one generation giving rise to the other, and alternate production of spores and gametes. So this alternation of generation is a salient feature that gave rise to the modern plants. It is very essential to understand and remember how it started. So sporophyte and gametophyte are the two stages that produce spores and gametes respectively. Okay, so the structure that you're seeing right now is a gametophyte. These leafy things that are on the screen right now are the gametophytes. and spores will come back to it. Spores is the most interesting part about bryophytes. So the sporophyte, which is formed from the gametophyte, because they have that deal, no, they give rise to each other. So they are actually dependent, almost parasitic on the gametophytic stage. That is a characteristic feature of bryophytes. Now, with these three things in mind, we will go and see more of liverworts and hornworts, and then mosses. So liverworts, they're called so because it was believed that they cure liver diseases. I don't know about that, but this is how they look. Now, if you look at algae, most of them will have this dichotomous structure that the thallus will be divided into exactly two parts and not more than that. So this dichotomy points at the primitive nature of any form. Anything that is dichotomous is primitive. Okay, so liverworts have this dichotomous form, and even the end of its thallus has a look which almost points to dichotomy. It will have bilateral symmetry, and in that tip at the end, in that notch at the end, it has produced some structures, some bulb-like structures you can see. So these structures are the sporophyte. So the thallus, the leaf-like structure, is the gametophyte, the gamete, male and female cell-producing organ, and that knob is the sporophyte. So this is how a liverwort looks naturally. Okay, and then there came this hornworts, these big short people. Okay, they were like, I can't do with such tiny sporophytes. I need something pompous, some bigger structures which will spread my spores far and wider. So then, with no much difference in the gametophyte, they started producing these long, elongated sporophytes, like the one you see here, and that is precisely why they're called hornworts. They have horns. So this is the basic difference between liverworts and hornworts, and both of them can be seen at different places, in forests, in gardens, wherever there's a lot of moisture and good soil, and even on wet walls you can see both of these. Now after these two came the third one, the mosses. Now look at these mosses very carefully. I'm sure you've seen them before, but just look at them for me right now. They have the sporophyte like a hornwort, right? But there's one difference. It seems like it took the sporophyte of the liverwort, which was a stubby one, and it raised on the sporophyte of a hornwort. So now it has a horn and it has a stub. So this is the sporophyte of a moss. Another silent feature of moss is it will have leaf-like and stem-like structures. And they're exactly leaf and stem because they don't form from the classical way that leaves and stems are supposed to form, but they resemble structures of leaf and stem, and even root-like structures they have. So mosses is the first form on earth that has a root-like, stem-like and leaf-like structures. You see how this whole function, this whole unit is like slowly moving towards the taking shape of the land plants that we see today, right? So another good thing that mosses had was they also had tubes for conducting water. Now before, when there were algae or when there were liverworts and hornworts, their body was so simple that it did not require a tube, a special unit for transporting water and nutrients. It could just happen between the cells very quickly. But when mosses started growing and they had this big bodies which had a lot of organs and stuff, then it felt the need that they should have some tubes which will carry stuff from here to there. So that was the first time plants had something like this, a conducting system. Okay, so mosses are now inching towards the land plants, the flowering plants that we see today. The picture that you see on the bottom of the slide, that is the sporophyte, that is the bulb of the sporophyte, which contains the spores. Now if you look at it carefully, it has a pore, okay, which is covered by a very thin membrane, and it also has teeth-like projections inside which controls the spore dispersal. So now not only mosses were careful with the dispersal of its spores, they also had mechanisms to control it. Now when the sporophyte is young, it has to make sure that not a lot of other insects or dust or stuff like that is coming inside. So the pore was uh, protected by different structures. Now what happens is when moss runs out of water, like when there's no monsoon anymore, the spores, the sporophyte, the bulb, it will dry out, the pore will open and the spores will be dispersed. Now this happens at the end of the monsoon, so that the spores will remain in air and in the surrounding area for rest of the year till the next monsoon comes. And when the next monsoon comes, these leafy structures will start germinating out of the spores, which will be the gametophyte. So a sporophyte, its spores will germinate to form a gametophyte. Gametophyte will produce a sporophyte, which will produce spores, and the cycle keeps continuing. That is alternation of generation, and it started from bryophytes. So I think we're done pretty much about bryophytes, and we'll move on to the next interesting beings that are pteridophytes. Now, pteridophytes is again derived from a Greek word, two Greek words, which is pteris is fern and phyton is tree. So this is fern tree. Now, if you look at ferns, the structure on the left has these dichotomous things that we talked about for bryophytes, right? So that points out that this is quite primitive, not as advanced as the flowering plants. So coming to the salient features of pteridophytes. The first important feature is they're the first terrestrial plants. They're completely terrestrial. They require water, of course, all plants require water, but they're not as dependent on water as bryophytes were. So now we have our first terrestrial plants, okay? And if you look at the structures as in the consecutive slides, you would be able to, you see that they have leaf-like structures and stem-like structures and also proper roots this time. Okay, so from mosses which have all like structures, which look like leaves, which look like stem, which look like roots, now they actually have roots and something that resembles stem and leaf a lot. Okay, and again, because this much of modification was too much, we'll take it slow. So the alternation of generation still stays. Okay, but there is a very important big difference between bryophytes and pteridophytes, which is, do you remember in bryophytes, the sporophyte was partially parasitic on its gametophyte? That means gametophyte was a mother here, right? She was bichari nursing the sporophyte till the spores were released. So in pteridophytes, there happened a switch. Now maybe it happened something like the gametophyte was too tired of taking care of the sporophyte and it told you, now you get out of my house and take care of yourself on your own. So the pteridophytes took it upon their mind and they decided that the sporophyte will be their dominant state. So unlike the bryophytes, what you see here is actually a sporophyte. It is not a structure that springs up sometimes. It is the ferns that we plant in our pots is actually a sporophyte of that plant, of the fern. Okay, so that is a major difference between bryophytes and pteridophytes. Now, I told you that it has leaf-like and stem-like structure, right? Here it is. You see a nice stalk and you see leaves, right? So this nice stalk and the leaves is together called a frond. It is not a leaf, but a frond. Okay, and the leaf are not leaves, but they're called pinna or leaflets, like the ear pinna, the same way. So this structure, do you see that the leaf here is curled like that? This is also a character that is primitive and which is, you'll want to remember this because it will come again in the next type of plants as well. So what happens is when, like flowers, when the leaves are younger, they will require protection because the plant doesn't want any insects to munch on to the young leaves, right? So it will make at most care. The new leaves will be folded upon themselves and the frond will be curled like that into itself. So, and when it's time to mature, it will slowly roll out and the leaves will spread out. So that is how a leaf emerges from a fern. If you have a fern at home, make sure you observe this. It is a slow process. You can even do a time lapse, you never know. So after looking at the stem and the leaf-like structure, we'll look at what the deal about the spores is. Now this is the perfect way to see a fern. Okay, whenever you come across a fern, it should be late monsoon for best results. So when you see a fern, you just take one in your hand and you turn it over and you see magic. You see intricate designs of spores producing organs at the back of the leaf. That is why this plant is a sporophyte. It produces spores, right? So in this picture on the right of the screen, you'll see there are dotted structures at the back of the leaf. You'll see they're arranged nicely, neatly, uniformly on each pinna, and they uh, contain spores. Right now, because they're light in color, they are immature yet. They have spores inside of them which are not mature. It's not ready to dehisce as yet. So this is how you look at a fern and check for its spores. Now, why spores are important? So like imagine a flowering plant. Okay, the flower produces a fruit. The fruit is raw. It's still on its tree, and eventually the fruit ripens, and then it dehisces. Then the fruit falls off the tree. Some bird will eat it, some human will eat it, and the seed will be dispersed. Right. So this is the dispersal mechanism of plant, and the process is simple. That when the fruit is raw, it will stay on the tree. When it is mature, it will fall off and the seed will be dispersed. The same mechanism is followed for spores. Now, have you noticed that not all fruit come at once? They'll come in stages, right? They'll come in cycles, they'll come in batches. So same way, the spores are also produced in batches. And if a fern is smart enough to understand it requires to produce and mature its spores in batches, it can be said that it has evolved. So if you see spores like the second picture in the top row, where all the spores mature at once, the entire border is brown. So brown is matured in ferns. Okay. So if the entire border is brown and matured, that means all the spores are going to be dispersed all at once. And if you look at other ferns, other sori that there are, other brown spots behind the leaves, you'll see that they're all separate. They're individual dots, and they have the liberty to mature at their own pace. And they will decide when it is matured and when the spore should be dehisced. Now, if there's a tree which has maturing and dispersal cycle in batches, that means a lot of spores can be dispersed, and the spores will stay for longer duration. Like even the first dispersed spores will survive, and even the last dispersed spores will survive, which will ensure the survival of this fern into that surrounding. Otherwise, if a fern by mistake just disperses all its spores at once, and there's a calamity and there's unfavorable conditions, then the spores will be wasted, and there'll be no next generation, no next fern. So that is why a fern which will give rise to spores and disperse them in batches is the smarter one, is the more evolved one. Okay. So now about pteridophytes that we need to remember: the taxis, the arrangement of leaf in the curled manner, and sporophyte being the dominant state. Oh, I forgot to add one thing. So there's a sporophyte and a gametophyte, and there happens an alternation of generation, right? And we saw that the ferns that we plant in our pots are, in fact, sporophytes. But then where's the gametophyte? Now I want you to look carefully at this picture on your screens right now. Do you remember what it looks like? Does it look like a bryophyte to you? A bryophyte which has a simple thallus and root-like structures? Exactly, right? So this is also a proof that bryophytes were the generation that came before pteridophytes. Now this is a gametophyte. This is formed from germination of spore of the fern. Okay, the brown dots that are at the back of the leaf of a fern will fall into ground, it will germinate, and such a structure will be formed. Now, this structure will contain male and female organs, and water will facilitate the fertilization. That is, the gametes will meet and a seed will be formed. Now, because these are all primitive creatures, they do not disperse their seed because they have no mechanism to do so. They cannot form a fruit which will fall off. So that seed just sits into the female thallus, the female part, the leaf that carries the female organ. And in the second picture on right, if you see, a new leaf is emerging out of this basic leaf-like structure, right? That new leaf is a sporophyte, because that thallus was carrying a seed which germinated and gave rise to the sporophyte, the big leafy fern. So this is where two generations of a sporophyte end, and now the sporophyte will grow and produce spores. The spores will fall into ground, germinate into gametophyte, that is these leafy little structures, and the leafy little structures will again give rise to sporophyte. Alternation of generation. Okay, don't worry. I know this is very complicated, but it will end now because evolution. So next step that is coming is gymnosperms. The sperm is a seed, and gymno is naked. So these are trees that bear naked seeds. Now why naked? So if you look at the form of gymnosperms, you'll see that they're nice, huge trees. They don't look primitive at all, right? They have a nice stem, proper stem. They have a root system that anchors it to the ground, and it also has leaves like structures. They're leaves, but they're needles because gymnosperms have decided that they don't want leaves which are high maintenance and too fragile for their atmosphere, their environment. So they decided that it will have needles. So now this is a proper legit plant. Okay, after these first vascular plants that came into being, the ferns, they evolved into plants which will have nice proper structure now, which are the gymnosperms. Okay, now just like pteridophytes, they also produce spores. They will produce male spores and female spores. Okay, and those two will come together, they'll fertilize and they'll form a seed. Now because the spore producing organs do not have structures that will form a fruit around that seed, it's a naked seed. So the seed just sits there on the plant, it is eventually dehisced, it is eventually dispersed, and it will germinate into a new gymnosperm. Now there is no gametophyte coming here, right? It will come, but you don't have to worry about it. It's very minuscule and we don't have to worry about it at all. So, in gymnosperms, these gametophytes are reduced to just single cells. So, what happens is when there is a male spore and where there's a female spore, the both will germinate. They'll divide into number of cells, which is their fashion, and that germinated cell will be the gametophyte. That's it. No separate structure for it. So there's just one sporophytic tree which forms these spores, and the spores just convert into gametes, the gametophytes, and then the seed is formed. Okay. Now, if we remember, the pteridophyte did not have a seed, right? But the gymnosperms do. They have a sperm. They have the seed. This is the first time seed is formed in plant kingdom. So then we go to gymnosperms, which are, for convenience, according to their evolution types, are divided into cycads and conifers. So cycads is something like this, a palm-like tree which is planted everywhere in the garden because it's so pretty, it lives long, it will outlive you even, unless you decide to do some experiments on it. So this cycas is a household name, like everybody has seen it, I'm very sure. So to think, do you remember seeing this in Jurassic Park movies and all? Because of their archaic appearance, they are quite famous for all these evolutionary movies which talk about evolution and the primitive ages and stuff. So Cycas here, this is a sporophytic generation. Okay, because pteridophytes have set that trend now. The sporophyte will be the dominant state. Okay, so Cycas is a gymnosperm, that is, it bears a naked seed. How? We'll see in the next slide. So it has different trees for producing male spores and female spores. The first one is the male cone. Now you must have heard this, that conifers, they produce cones, right? So the male cone and the female cone are different. The male cone is a structure very compact like that, and it has each of that petal can, if you pull it out, it will have spores laden on it. On the other hand, there's a female. It's not a cone because it's not a compact structure, and it doesn't have just all the appendages that are required for it to be called a cone. So it's just simply called a megasporophyll. Phyll is leaf, and mega is giant because female spores are large. They're called megasporophyll. Okay, so this female will have a leaf, and it will have male gametes attached to it. If you see, there are some globular structures in the picture on the right. Those are the female gametes, female spores. Now, do you remember something? The ferns had spores on its leaf. That has been continued in the gymnosperms as well. And that, I promise you, will be continued in plants as well. And we'll see that when we come there. So coming back to the megasporophyll, what happens is when this male cone is ready, it will open up just a bit, and the wind will carry those pollens to the female plant. The female plant will receive it. It has a sticky juice around it, which will attract and trap the pollens, and then there'll be fertilization and there'll be seed formation. So wherever there are female spores, the globular structures, only they will slightly be modified into seeds, and then that seed will be dispersed and the new gymnosperm, new cycas will be formed. Now Next one. This is a pinus and it has cones. So we'll just breeze through these, okay? So even they have the same mechanism. They have needle-like leaves, and they are in high altitude cold temperatures, and they have these male cones and female cones. The male cones will produce spores which will be carried by wind to the female cones. The female cones will bear those male spores. There'll be fertilization, there'll be seed production, the cone will open up slightly and the seeds will be dispersed. Easy. So these are the female cones and the male cones in Pinus. Same mechanism as that of Cycas, with a lot of anatomical changes, but theoretically it's the same. Now this is my favorite bit of this presentation. Now look at this very ordinary looking plant, okay, but do you notice that it has a dichotomous branching? Do you remember what that means? It means it's primitive, right? Like the bryophytes, they had a structure which bifurcated in two and it pointed at the primitive nature of that structure. This, my friends, is a living fossil. This plant is called ginkgo or jingo, whatever you feel like calling it, doesn't mind. So this is a living fossil, and it is found only in China and Japan and all those high-altitude places where nobody can practically go. And this specimen, one specimen is present in Uti Botanical Garden. Now I'll tell you about ginkgo and the miracle that it was found into. Okay, so ginkgo is the oldest living plant in this world, the oldest one. It was formed 270 million years ago, like a seed-bearing plant. Okay, this is the oldest seed-bearing plant. And this was the first tree which had separate tree for male gametes and female gametes. Okay, and it has survived 3 mass extinctions. Can you believe that this tree has lived through all of them? It has lived, and it's here in front of us. And the funniest thing is, it was discovered at the epicenter of Hiroshima atomic bomb blast. What are the odds? I mean, it just sprang to life because of one atomic explosion. Before that, it had been missing for quite some time, but it survived an atomic explosion. I mean, who can do that? Except for maybe cockroaches. But we're talking about plants here, so focus. So this ginkgo is this phenomenal plant, a living fossil, and this is a legend in plant worlds. I'm sure all the plants talk about it and think it should be like ginkgo someday. And look at the respect we have for it. There's garbage thrown into its bin as if it's something useless, as if it doesn't mean anything at all, as if it's garbage. That's human beings for you. I hope we don't survive the next mass extinction. Going to the next one. Now here's the interesting part. Look at this plant very carefully. Now I hope in that meantime you look at this plant very carefully. Now don't be too surprised if I tell you this is actually a gymnosperm. Do you remember how Cycas looked? Do you remember how Pinus looked? It had needles. And this guy is a gymnosperm. It produces naked seeds. And it looks like a flowering plant. I mean, that's evolution. I mean, so it decided that it doesn't want to have those dry, leafless, dull leaves. It wanted to have legit leaves so that it has some respect in the world, right? So then came into existence Neetum, Gnetum, Neetum. And this phenomenal plant is an intermediate between gymnosperms and angiosperms, like a legit intermediate. It has characters which point to its affinity to gymnosperms, affiliation to gymnosperms, and also to angiosperms. Angiosperms, because we saw just now, it has nice broad leaves, exactly like that of a flowering plant. And it has a form, it's a big climber. It's a huge climber that can go through hectares of forest. And when you look at it carefully, you'll see that it has male cones and female cones. And seen here is a male cone, but you can also see that it produces some structures which resemble the stamens or the pollen producing structures of flower. Right? Do you remember how they appear in a flowering plant? So the male cone has stamen-like structures. So that again is like, this plant is almost like confused whether it wants to be a gymnosperm or an angiosperm, right? So Neetum is the key, like the connecting link between gymnosperms and angiosperms. So we've finally reached the good new flowering plants. And okay, so let's start about the flowering plants. Now, this should have been a common sight. It still is, just that we are not out there to see it. This is a golden shower plant, or the Indian laburnum, or amaltash, or kakke in Kannada. Those are all the languages that I know. So this is a angiosperm. Angio is cover. Angion is a cover, and sperm is obviously a seed. So now it points to the fact that these plants will produce a fruit, a covering around its seed. Okay, these are the most evolved plants, obviously, because we're almost at the end of my presentation. And it is a seed that is enclosed in a fruit, unlike gymnosperms, which had shameless naked seeds, and it produces flowers. Now that's a big leap from producing some structures that barely contain the spores and not so specialized, to a nice, fancy, beautiful organ which will produce the male and female spores. Now, again, keeping in tradition with the trend that Pteridophytes set, the Fern set, the tree that we see, the plant, is a sporophyte. It produces spores, which are male and female, inside the flower. And when those spores germinate, they are called the gametophyte. So gametophyte state is almost diminished again to just one, some short duration and some cells. That's it. Some nuclei, in fact, just one cell. Right? So now we don't have to worry about the gametophytes at all. But that is the reason why there's so much diversity in this world in plants. Now, another salient feature is they use animals for pollen and seed dispersal. None of them did that before. Like bryophytes and pteridophytes, they depended on water for their dispersal. Gymnosperms use animals to some extent. Some of their seeds are edible, so the animals carry them. And they also depend on winds for pollination. The pollens are carried through wind. Even in flowering plants, they are, but even then, there's a lot of interaction of flowering plants with the animals. So that points to the era where they evolved, and also the animals were evolving during that time. So both of them evolved depending on each other, and they evolved simultaneously, and that is why there's such a close interrelationship between the two, so close that there's a plant animal interaction section of science for us. So that is a salient feature of angiosperms. Now, going into more details, don't get scared by the diagram, it's quite simple. So now these evolved beings, they have proper roots, proper stem, proper leaves, no confusion at all. They have different forms of presence, like they can be herbs, they can be herbaceous. That is, they will have a slender stem, they will not have woody structures. They'll be climbers, like remember Nitamula, like a very big, sturdy, woody climber. Or it can also be a slender climber which climbs through using tendrils. They can be shrubs, that is, they will have a woody stem, but it will be branched from the base itself. That is the classic definition of shrubs. And there'll be trees, huge trees. So this classification exists only in uh, modern flowering plants. The herbs, shrubs, climbers, and trees, they are present only in the modern flowering plants. They have a well-developed conducting system. Now, if you have leaves, stem, branches, flowers, fruits, seeds, so much, then you'll obviously need a specialized feature that will be only dedicated to carrying water and food throughout the plant, right? So now it obviously has a very well-developed conducting system, which we thankfully won't go into, which is very, very complicated, and we have wasted like days drawing those diagrams. So, good riddance. And they are obviously the most diverse kind of plants. Now, surprisingly, it's obvious that they're diverse because they're the most evolved, right? But after flowering plants, the most diverse kind of plants are ferns. Can you believe that? Like gymnosperms move aside, ferns will be the first one to come and say we have second most number of species. So in flowering plants, there are about 26,000 species that are divided into families for convenience of their study. And these are 416 families according to the latest classification system. And so, okay, so we saw gymnosperms and we are looking at angiosperms now. But the surprising thing is there is no definitive theory about how gymnosperms got turned into angiosperms. There is no link that has been discovered yet. And I hope that someday we will find it, and I guess it will completely surprise us, because right now there are some theories that there was maybe a type of plant which is imaginary for now, which existed between gymnosperms and angiosperms, which gave rise to all the angiosperms. There's also a theory that gymnosperms directly gave rise to angiosperms of two types, monocots and dicots. You must have heard it, right? Ekdal and dvidal. Ekdal is the seed which will have just one cotyledon, that it will have, like, it will not divide into two. And dvidal, or the dicotyledonous, is the seed which will have two cotyledons. It will break into two parts, and which will give rise to the new plant. Right. So this monocot and dicot is also an important feature of flowering plants, which is important evolutionary because monocots are said to be more evolved than dicots. So then again, there are theories that gymnosperms simultaneously give rise to both. And there are theories that ferns give rise to flowering plants directly and not gymnosperms. So there are lots of theories like that, and nothing definitive has been proven yet. That will happen when it will, but for now, we will look at the immense diversity that can last our entire lifetime to look at. So now I will not speak a lot. I will just show you some beautiful flowers that I have seen through my very short experience. But today, when I was compiling all these photos, it was astonishing how much we see every day, and we register it in our minds, but we don't think about it in a flow, in a, like, we don't connect those things to each other, right? So this was definitely the purpose of my talk, that I wanted to connect all the things that we see in plant world, and I wanted you to understand how they are interdependent, interlinked in the evolution, and how they came into existence, and how we should actually be thankful for the existence and respect them. So to making the respecting part easier, here's the beauty that will blow your mind. So there's obviously a lot of diversity in flowering plants, and that is typically based on the flowers, the sexual organs of trees, which are so diverse in their forms, in their function in the sense, in the way they attract um, see insects or plants, or sorry, insects or animals, and in the way they interact with this environment, in the way they have just beautified themselves for various reasons, right? So we have a water lily, which is an aquatic plant, not to be confused with the lotus. The lotus has a nice bulb in the center. That is the most important thing that to remember, and how to differentiate between a water lily and a lotus. So this is a water lily, which is quite a primitive because it is in water. There's a Dutchman's pipe. So you'll see a bulb at the base. Now, let me tell you that all these families are arranged. Some of the families of the 416 families have been arranged according to their occurrence in the APG system of classification. Okay, so they are linked to evolution, that is at the genetic level, and not at their external appearance level strictly. Okay, so they may look like they're not related to each other, or they are very different from each other, but they are in fact quite in a sequence when you look at their genes. Okay, so just enjoy now. That is a golden yellow orchid, Habenaria. There's a glory lily. Glory lily is quite a common appearance in Maharashtra, southern India, along the Western Ghats. And the salient feature of this flower is, if you look at it, apart from the flames of petals that it has, it's an inverted flower. Like, it starts while it faces down, and when it blooms, it turns up, and the petals stay upwards, and the stamens and anthers are on the outer side. I don't know why that is, but it is there. And we are to sometimes just not think of the reason of something and just enjoy its form. Then there's grasses. Grasses are the most diverse, most smartest, and what do you say? Like, there are some grasses which have these appendages that will cling their seeds to anything that passes by. You must have seen those grasses stick to your body, right? When you walk through them, that is the seed dispersal mechanism. And how cool is that? They don't have to do anything. They just have to produce these hair on themselves, and the seed dispersal will be done. Then there's this ginger lily. It has very nice aromatic flowers. Then there's this Mexican poppy, which is a nice thorny plant with the equally delicate and dashing flower. There's traveler's joy, again a very, very aromatic flower. There's Delinia, very pretty to look at. There's Leah. Leah is in the family of grapes, Vitaceae. So the flowers of grapes look somewhat like that. Then there's snake gold, something that we eat, something that also we hate. So snake gold has this very pretty flower, and that is this family is Cucurbitaceae. It is characterized by all climbers. All of them are climbers, and they'll have tendrils. And then there's Pongamia, the tree that is quite common, well known to all us city dwellers because it's planted everywhere along our roads and in our gardens for their nice flowers, quite low maintenance, grows fast, grows quickly, does not make a lot of mess, etc. Then look at whistling pine. Now this one is my favorite. Now if you look at the fruits here, do they remind you of something? Do they remind you of gymnosperms? They look like that, right? And even the leaves that it has, these wiry structures that are coming out of from besides the flowers, they are the needle-like leaves. So for a long time, even I believed that it's a gymnosperm, but it's not. It's actually a flowering plant. And this cone-like structure is actually its fruit, and it has a seed inside of it. So just because it has a seed, it has a fruit and a seed inside of it, it's a flowering plant. It's an angiosperm. So next time you meet a whistling pine, or suru as it's called quite commonly, make sure you say, yeah, I know your secret now. You're a flowering plant and not a gymnosperm. So then there's also cluster fig. Now, what do I even start talking about cluster fig? Right from WhatsApp forwards that show some fungus or some weird flower and say that this is the flower of a fig and it's a rare occasion. It's not. This thing that is hanging from its stem is the flower. It encloses the flowers, and it has a very intimate relationship with wasp species which enter inside this fruit-like structure and pollinate the flowers inside, and then they can't leave, so they just die inside and they lay eggs inside. So it has its entire life cycle intertwined with this fig flower just because the flower is shaped like that. Then there comes mangrove, rhizophora. So this, when the flowering plants were formed, like how algae came to land, they saw opportunity. Some plants of different families, different areas, they saw that there's opportunity to start living along the coastal area where rivers meet the sea, where land meets the river and the sea, and then they produce different structures in their body. They modified their body and they turned into mangroves. So mangroves is a group of plants which have different species of different families even, and they have common adaptation to the difficult environment of estuary or creek, and they stay there, they maintain um, the coasts, they save the land from floods and calamities like tsunamis. So they're quite important for our survival, and the way coastal cities are taking them for granted is really a bad sign for our lives. Then there is this family called Brassicaceae, which is also the family of mustard. The flower looks quite similar. This one is not mustard though, it's called a rocket salad. And then there's Indian mallow. If you look at the flower carefully, you'll see it resembles of beauties. Drosera, I'm sure you know this one. It's quite famous for its ability to eat insects. I mean, all the other plants, they beacon at the insects to come and pollinate us, take our seeds away. This guy, come, I'll eat you. So that's evolution of even further evolution of flowering plants, because sundew plants live in an area where there's nitrogen deficiency. The soil is very thin. There's not much layer of soil, and it's a rocky substratum, so it cannot penetrate deeper to get nutrients. And because the area is waterlogged most in the monsoons, and this is the time when sundews grow, they have to look for some other sources of nutrition. And because of the waterlogging and those fertile conditions for insects to come, this plant decided, why not? Let's just eat them. So this is how insectivores came into being, and you'll always find them in areas where there's a rocky substratum, very thin layer of soil, and waterlogged conditions. So basically, the plateaus in Maharashtra, in the Sahyadris, are very, very, they support the population of insectivorous plants. There's South Indian mistletoe. Now, like some plants decided to depend on other insects for nutrition, some plants decided they'll depend on other plants for nutrition. So South Indian mistletoe or different species of mistletoe, they're actually hemiparasitic. That is, they are only half parasitic on other plants. They start growing on other plants. They insert their suckers, sucking roots inside the host plant, and they gain nutrition from it. They also have green leaves. Don't worry, they're not like entirely parasitic. They also produce their own food, but they also take nutrition from its host plant. And even these are quite essential for a lot of animals because they provide nectar and stuff. So then there's a balsam tree, which is impatience because of the way its fruits burst for dispersal of seeds. Then there's a cannonball tree, which has a very, very beautiful flower, which people have connected to mythological stories and characters. There's blue pimpernel, a very pretty blue flower. There's tea. I'm sure a lot most, like I hadn't seen the flower of tea for until quite recently. So tea is actually a quite big tree, and it is kept at a shrubby height so that the leaves can be harvested easily. And this is the flower of tea. Then there are other plants like Ixora, which is also a garden plant, which you'll see quite commonly everywhere. There's clustered morning glory. You'll see varieties, different forms of this kind of flower in along water, along railway tracks, along on the walls. They're all climbers. Then there's this devil's claw, quite interesting. It has a fruit which produces claw-like structure on it. It has two claws and it attaches to anything that passes by, the animal or even human, and the seed is taken away. So that's why it's called devil's claw. This broom rape. Now, how there was mistletoe, which was parasitic, but mistletoe is aerial, like it's epiphytic. It grows on the canopies of the tree, but broom rape here will grow on the roots of its host plant. So it's a root parasite, and mistletoe is a stem parasite. So there are various types of parasites. Then there's this family of all the masticatory substances like body soap, and ova, ajwain, and stuff like that. So Konkan Pinda conkinensis, is an endemic species to Western Ghats, and it is of the same family. So just a representative of that family. And finally, there comes this family Aster. If you remember the previous slide, it said that Asteraceae is the largest family of flowering plants. It has the most number of species in it, and that is just one of the forms of flowers of Aster. Aster is quite common, you'll see them everywhere. So like that, we have so much of diversity of all different levels of evolution of plants. And I think the next time, I'm sure that if you go to a forest, hopefully very soon, you will get to see all these forms, and something from this presentation might strike you, and it might make you acknowledge the forest better, acknowledge it at the root level, at the plant level, and not just for the animals and the big cats and stuff. So I hope that you've enjoyed, and I'll stop talking now.
So a question from Shabdulli Durge. Why is moss slimy or slippery?
Why is moss slimy?
Yeah.
Moss is not slimy. Algae are slimy because algae have to live in water, which is quite, water tends to dissolve everything, right? So it will be harmful for the tissues to just stay in water for long duration like that. It will disintegrate. It will decompose. So that's why, to protect it, mucilage is a membrane that protects the body of the alga. But mosses don't live in water like that, so they do not have a slimy body. They do not require the slime.
Okay.
I hope
one
I've
more
answered.
question from Deepankar Mukherjee. Since when did plant and fungi relationship begin?
I do not know when it began. All I can say is it's still existent, and it is one of the most important features of a forest. So if you have heard something like forest is a community, and plants communicate with each other, fungi play a very important role in that communication. So fungi have this roots, like a network of root-like structures which are called mycelia, and they connect different plants in an area. They connect everything, every plant in an area through the root. It has an underground system, and it carries the messages, the chemical messages from one tree to another, like nutrients, like threat signals and stuff like that. So I really don't know when it started. I'll look into it and I'll definitely talk about it.
Okay, sorry. So a person is asking which is the plant in the screen right now? The name of the plant?
In the slide right now?
Yeah, in the slide, yes.
Yeah, it's called Nymphoides cristata. It's a water lily like plant.
Okay. A question from Sneha Basu. Can you spread a bit light on pollination, few major species which help in pollination? Also, a few points on importance of bats in pollination.
Because of Rohit Chakravarti, recently came to know that many mangroves are bat pollinated, and I also checked what the flower does to attract bats. So basically, it will have a strong. It will bloom at night. Basically, that is the first and most important feature, and it will be high up and at the canopies and mostly inverted. It will bloom in this shape. So that is how the bats play a role in that. And pollination takes into account a lot of insects, like right from even mosquitoes are pollinating agents, and wasps and honeybees are they play important role in pollination. And to attract them, the flowers have different features. Like for honeybees, they'll have nectar. For the insects, it also attracts by the nectar, but to take the insect deeper inside the flower, many flowers have these dotted arrangements on their petals, which will I mean the only the insects will be able to see them because of the specific way they see. And then those dotted lines are also dotted with nectar, and they will lead that insect inside to the part where there are pollens, and that's how flowers facilitate its own pollination through insects.
Yeah. Is there a clear alternation of generation in gymnosperm? This question is from Sindhu.
There is no clear alternation like how we've seen in bryophytes and pteridophytes, but it does have alternation of generation in the way that when the male spore is ready on the male tree, it will in itself, without dehiscing or anything, it will the cell will undergo division, and it will form three cells. So from a single cell, there will be three cells inside the spore now, and that three cell stage is called the male gametophyte. And similar change happens in the female spore, which then turns into female gametophyte. And when this three cell structure is taken by the wind to the female gamete, then the fertilization happens. So that is the only time when the spores are called gametes. And same happens in plants also. So the plant is majorly sporophytic, and only this one stage in its before its fertilization, it turns into a gametophyte. That's it.
And a question from Darshan. Which kingdom does the coral reefs come into?
Coral reefs are animal. They're not plants.
Does the living fossil still have the same DNA as earlier present?
Yes. It has not changed at all. And it's the only one. It doesn't have any living relatives which are closely genetically similar to it. That is precisely why it's called a living fossil.
Okay. A question from Swada. Can you recommend a good film or documentary for understanding plants and trees?
There are a few, like Secret Life of Plants and Hidden World of Plants. I'll share some more names too.
Okay. Can you please tell me which air purifying plant is best for Indian weather? This question is from Siddhi.
Okay, so a lot of plants have this air purification. Basically, it depends on what exactly you want to purify. There are some plants which specifically take the sulfur oxides and the nitrogen or nitrous oxides, and those are plants like neem, some ficuses and stuff. And these days, plants like EnviCA and dracaenas, they are marketed as air purifiers. Also, peace lily is a good air purifier. So if you just want your air to be abundant in oxygen, then you can plant any plant inside your house. It is no problem. You just have to take care of the requirement of water and sun. I think all plants are quite good for the air.
Okay. So here is a question from Dipankar again. What is the next trend in plant evolution?
Next trend. So, thank you for this question. I actually missed this. So, if you remember, alga was simple, then it went to complexity, and now it's again tending to simplicity. But so what happens is a tree is now considered as a lofty form, so it's not very practical to maintain all that. So to conserve energy, the plants are tending to reducing its forms. The herbs are more advanced, more evolved than plants. So eventually, I think the trees and the lofty climbers, the woody climbers, will go extinct, and only the herbaceous forms will prevail. And so grasses is a classic example of great evolution. Also orchids is another example. Grasses have a very simple form. It has just blades of leaves, and the flowers are arranged in such a way that the wind will carry its pollens, and the life cycle is very short. It gets over within a few months. So characters like that are the next step in evolution of plants.
So could you give your comments on lichens and the type of relationship, as they have always been contradictory statements about the same? This is by a person called VN.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what contradictory statement you heard. Lichens is a classic example of symbiosis, which is coexistence with mutual benefits to the coexisting partners. And lichens are formed from fungi and algae. So the structure that lichens are is formed by the fungi, and the photosynthetic partner is the algae. So fungi produce some nutrients and protection, and algae produce the food for the entire form to survive. And they are good indicators of pollution. They live in different environments. Like you find lichens from very dry weathers to even very wet weathers, and you have different forms into them. So that's all I can say without knowing what contradictory statements you have heard.
Okay, all right. So speaking about the plant evolution, there's a question again. So would it be gymnosperms or angiosperms which will thrive in this current situation where there is huge variation in the climate, the climate change, the global warming? What do you think will survive? The angiosperms, gymnosperms, or unicelled organisms?
Okay, so gymnosperms already show a sign of decline in their distribution and their diversity. So I think, like I said, grasses are the most advanced ones, right? They are very adaptive also. They exist in a lot of varied type of habitats. So flowering plants through grasses will, I think, sustain the plant kingdom, is what I think from what I know right now. But
okay. Are there any evolutionary trade-offs being known in plants?
so, like I said, there is no definite origin of angiosperms known. There is no link between, like exact direct link between gymnosperms and angiosperms. And so, monocots are said to be a different direction that evolution took. Like ideally, from the one seed that gymnosperms produce, the angiosperm was the obvious thing to happen, but monocots are also evolved during that time. So that is one of the examples. And in angiosperms itself, there are a lot of examples like that. I'll have to think a bit to answer that question, but I'll definitely come with an answer.
What is meant by evolution from simple to complex?
Like if you're talking about what I said just now, from simple to complex, it means, see, there was alga, which had a very simple body. Like it had single cell, a strand of cell, a simple thallus which did not have different types of organs for different functions. There was just one thallus which performed all the functions. So that is simplicity. But it went on to evolving to have stem, leaf, root, and stuff like that. So that is complexity. So evolutionary, the organism tries to diversify it. And like if it feels that there's too much pressure and too much uncertainty because of its form, now it will have to change itself to a more complex, a more diversified being for ensuring survival in changing conditions. So that is what evolution from simplicity to complexity means. Okay.
And there is one repeat question. So the person is asking, would the DNA in the primitive life form would the quality of the DNA remain the same, or will it be degraded?
See, DNA is expressed through its external form. Like DNA itself requires to express itself. Like it will thrive to individual, thrive to generations. So if that form of the living organism is not sufficient, is not sturdy enough to withstand the conditions, that DNA obviously will perish. Like if there's a fern which is unable to produce spores and unable to complete its life cycle, then that that one generation will vanish and its DNA also will go off. So there's a primitive DNA which is unable to carry on to the next generation, it will perish.
Can you
Yeah.
explain why do trees exhibit crown shyness? Crown shyness?
Ground shyness. Okay. So I don't know the exact reason for it, but my hypothesis is because it has the crowns, they all they come close to each other. So crown shyness is when the crowns they come close to each other and they maintain some boundary between some area between the two crowns, that is called crown shyness, and they start receding away from each other. So one obvious reason is they don't want to intercede each other's leaves. They don't want to create crowding. Also because if one tree is infected with some fungal or bacterial disease, because the canopy is in close contact with that canopy, the disease will immediately shift to other plants, and that will continue to the entire canopy if they're connected. So that is basically why I think crown shyness is a phenomenon, to save themselves from lack of sunlight primarily, and also to prevent spread of diseases.
So a question from Venkatarama. Is there a possibility in the future where one type of plant can evolve into another? Can you genetically modify a plant to change it from one type to another?
Genetic modification has been happening for human benefit. Like a lot of crops are genetically modified to produce better seeds, seeds with more nutrients than they naturally have, seeds with different nutrients than they naturally have, like corn, cotton, stuff like that are genetically modified. But these modifications, I don't think play a role in evolution, because most of them are sterile. They cannot produce a further generation. The seeds are sterile, they cannot germinate and make a new generation. And naturally evolution is still happening, but it's obviously so slow that you cannot like pinpoint that this change happened in this plant and this will lead to evolution. You cannot say that. But evolution is a sum of different mutations that randomly happened, and the natural selection came into being and then selected the best mutations that work. So that is how evolution has been happening all these years. So it is an ongoing process still, and it is possible that the current plants will change into different plants. But I really hope that genetic modifications that humans do into plants don't play a role in that.
So a question by Neelima. There are a lot of plants in the red list, near extinction list. We see at least some efforts to save some animals around the world. Do you know if there are any efforts for any plants?
So actually the efforts that are being taken place for conservation of animals should work for plants. You know why? Because if you take tiger conservation, tiger is said to be an umbrella species, which means if tiger is conserved, a lot of diversity around it is conserved, because tiger needs a habitat, and habitat have to be trees. So that is how it should happen. But the thing is, when you think of, there's a lot of lack of awareness regarding this. Like if you are conserving tiger in Madhya Pradesh, you have to plant trees that exist in Madhya Pradesh. You cannot plant trees that are from the Nilgiris of South India there. So if that is not happening, if you are taking care that the native local species are being planted for creation of habitats for animals, then the plants will be taken care of. Second thing, efforts that are being taken care is awareness. Like there are so many trees that are just cut and discarded, thinking they're useless, thinking they are not useful to humans. So why to even let them live? That mindset, if it's changed, and it is being changed through all these sessions about awareness, then it will help. It does help in conservation. Then there are efforts by a lot of NGOs which identify different species, and because of that one species, that whole area is being protected, which leads to protection of a lot of species in that area, not just one particular species. So to sum it up, conservation of animals, if done right, is supposed to conserve plants as well. Discovery of new species and creating awareness about how they're important to the environment, how they're unique in themselves, how they're evolutionary important, and stuff like that, will lead to conservation of that plant and also the surrounding area, the habitat of that plant. And basic awareness about how plants are important to us, and awareness about exotic species being planted in gardens and in plantations and stuff like that is helpful in conserving plants.
So there is one effort from Karnataka government, a place called Gadag. So they have identified a whole sanctuary, and this sanctuary is completely filled with medicinal plants. So that has been, last year it has been declared as a wildlife sanctuary only because of the plants. So I think that's one of the recent developments.
That's fantastic. Yes, Forest Department has been doing a lot. Even the project that I was a part of, Karnataka Biodiversity Board, even they were working on identifying the medicinal plants and knowing the population status of those plants in forests of Karnataka, so that they can be conserved and the scenario can be checked and controlled. So even that is an effort to conserve plants.
So here's a question from Arjun. What is your take on afforestation as a sole remedy for climate change?
I don't believe in afforestation. I'm sorry, because of Terracon, thankfully, I got an exposure to this. That many corporates do the afforestation drives, even forest departments do it. But the problem is they plant just one species everywhere, and that species is something that grows easily. That species is often not from that area, so it changes the habitat entirely. And just one species from a very different habitat, unsuitable to the current habitat, unsuitable to the faunal diversity of that habitat, will not form a forest. So afforestation is not the solution. Conserving the forests that are existent, because forest is not just trees, it's not just 10 individuals standing together, it's their interaction, it's the way they have evolved through the years with each other, with the animals around them, with the humans around them. That is what makes them a forest, and you cannot build a forest. You have to give it years and years for an area, for a forested area, even if done right, to become a forest. So afforestation is like it's just an idea that was invented so that cutting trees can be allowed, so that some company will promise that they'll plant more trees in the name of one tree that's cut. It's not good, not enough.
There are a couple of questions related to biotechnology. Are you comfortable answering them? Can I ask them? Here, a question from Ashirwad: is there any genetically modified plant that is glowing that is glowing using firefly bioluminescence gene? Yes, there are. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
No. You please tell me.
No, please.
No, I was just guessing that gene has been used to genetically modify as a part of an experiment, but please elaborate on that.
Yeah. So they use clean fluorescence protein. They incorporated that particular gene into the plants which are genetically being modified. So let's say there are 10 plants, and then you want to know where your gene is actually in a particular plant. Let's say in 10 plants, so only 1 or 2 plants will have the DNA. And if there is a DNA, that plant will automatically glow. So it's easier for the selection process during the experimentation. So that's the reason why they use green fluorescence protein. And okay, here's a question for you from Neelima. What are the ways to find the native species of an area, since these days there are so many non-natives around?
Right. So that is a very good question. There are if for me it was worked like you have to study the plants, you have to basically go through forests a lot to understand what kind of forest has what kind of plants. So if you are living in an area which has a average temperature and average rainfall and stuff like that, which matches that of a dry deciduous forest, so you essentially should have plants that shed leaves in summers and that flower during post monsoon and stuff like that. So you'll have to find areas in your area, patches in your area which have undisturbed plantations, which have not been altered by humans, their activities or their plantation drives. And then you can say that these are the plants that actually existed here. Also, one key is to recognize the old trees that have existed. But then also there's an issue that there are a lot of baobab trees in Mumbai which have existed here since a long time, but it cannot be said that baobab is a native species here. So I think going to forests that are undisturbed by humans is the best way to understand the species that exist in one place.
Here's a biotechnology question. Are there any behavioral study on how plants fight against different diseases and how those behavioral studies are done?
Okay, so a lot of biotechnology studies have been done to combat drought and infections like bacterial and viral. And what they do is they study proteins that plants produce when they are subjected to these conditions. Like if there's a plant that is subjected to a drought condition, then the scientists will study the proteins that it has produced to survive, obviously from the surviving plant. And then it will isolate the gene that produces these proteins and incorporate it into crops which require drought, which require to sustain drought. And that's how it is done to make them fight diseases and adverse conditions.
Okay. Here's a question by Sneha. There are already existing forests in India which had been created by villagers by afforestation. Will they not survive?
Okay, so with the forests that have been created by villagers, they are often protected by some superstition. They're also called devrais. It is a classic example of these human-created forests. And the thing is, when villagers plant trees, they are often not, if they're traditional enough, they're not facilitated by one species that government will give them saplings of, and they'll plant them in an area haphazardly. So these villagers, or we can call them tribals, they plant different species and they give that area enough time to turn into a forest. They don't do it for some particular purpose that this area should look green, this area should combat my atmospheric pollution and stuff like that. So if the forest area has been there for a long time, if it has a lot of diversity in tree forms and in its there's vertical stratification, that is there are herbs, there are shrubs, and there are trees, climbers, all of them, and not just trees, then it's likely to survive. It will survive.
There is one class of plants called as resurrection plants. I'm not sure you guys have heard about it. Resurrection plants. Have you heard about it?
No.
So,
I have.
So this is like the extreme behavior of a plant where the plant will go into complete hibernation mode. So if you look at that plant in hibernation mode, it's completely dry, super dry. And if it rains, say after 10 years, 15 years, just few drops will completely revive the plant.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating way of interpretation.
Yeah, a lot of algae and bryophytes and mosses, they show this like revival of plants. Their spores have this great survival instinct. They can like live through a lot of generation in the dormant state, and someday when the weathers are favorable, they'll spring back to life. This is called the mosses are also sold under the name Sanjeevani booty, and it's the moss called Selaginella.
Thank you, Sai. It was a wonderful session. We thoroughly enjoyed your slides. The pictures were amazing. Your explanation was amazing. We like the way you presented. You're super witty.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.